X-Men is unique in comics history. Unlike Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and most other popular superheroes, which were defined by many creators over decades, the X-Men's wild success is due almost entirely to one writer, Chris Claremont.
Comics was something I did when I went to get a haircut. You know, sitting around waiting for a barber, didn't want to read Ladies' Home Journal. So if there were comics I read comics.
As a university student, Chris was tasked with finding an internship, a task which took him into the world of comics.
My parents had a friend, Al Jaffe, the artist for Mad Magazine, and I thought it'd be cool to work as a volunteer for Mad, because from all accounts, Mad was cool. Al evidently called up my parents and said, "There is no way in hell I'm going to take your son into the office. Do you have any idea what we do in there? Because you'll never speak to me again." But Al said, "I know Stan Lee. If he's interested, I can see about getting him a job at Marvel." And I said, "Cool." And the minute I said, since it's school, I'll work for free, I was in.
When I first came into Marvel, there were people sleeping under desks. There was a giant papier-mâché figure of Thor suspended from the ceiling. I mean, DC was like an insurance office. Marvel was, I said, home.
Or they would decide to set up offices in the bathroom, or people would come in with balloons, helium balloons, with their thoughts over their heads, and it was really fun.
There was so much creativity that it just boiled over.
Yeah.
It wasn't contained, it boiled over onto the walls, it spilled out into the bullpen.
Yeah.
While Marvel comics of the 60s may seem dated now, at the time they were hailed for a realism and relatability previously unseen in comics.
The challenges that the Marvel heroes would come across were more down to earth. And because they were more down to earth, they made the superheroics part of things a little more accessible. It wasn't that Spidey would defeat Doc Ock. It was, will he get the test in on time? Will he work things out with Gwen Stacy? Everybody was flawed, which made the Marvel characters that much more accessible and interesting from a dramatic side of things, and more fun to play with. And as far as the X-Men were concerned, no one really knew from one issue to the next, were they respectable, were they hated, were they loved, were they what? They'd save the world and nobody'd say thank you.
X-Men was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963. They introduced the basic premise of mutants fighting for a world that hates and fears them, and some of the series' notable characters. But the book was not considered a major achievement next to more successful Marvel titles like Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, or The Avengers.
The X-Men back in the 60s was a commercial failure ultimately. It got canceled. But it was always a book that had loyal readers. It was always an intelligent book, even though it was sort of a second, even third string book.
And there was talk for a number of years about possibly reviving the book as a group of international heroes based on the fact that a lot of Marvel books sold very well in various other foreign countries, and they thought if they could get heroes from those countries in this book, it would increase the sales even more.
Editor Len Wein and artist Dave Cockrum were tasked with creating an all-new, all-different team of international X-Men.
Dave Cockrum was already a fan favorite from his work on Legion of Superheroes.
And he showed me his sketchbooks from the Navy.
Dave had a notebook, he had a dozen notebooks filled with sketches of characters he did.
You'd ask him for a costume design, he'd come in with 40 pages of artwork.
So it's where we found Nightcrawler and Colossus, Thunderbird, all came from that.
Giant Size X-Men #1 was released in May 1975, the first new X-Men story in 5 years. It was successful enough to justify continuing the series.
It was supposed to be a quarterly because Marvel wasn't sure it would sell. After Dave had started working on the second issue, the editorial decision came down to make the book a bi-monthly.
And X-Men, I really didn't intend to give up initially.
But he didn't have time to do a bi-monthly X-Men.
And when I said, gee, I don't know, should I give up the X-Men, should I keep it? Chris just sort of sat there and went, I'll take it, me over here.
So he asked if I was interested. And I said, hell yes.
In his early issues, Claremont began to develop this new cast of characters and started laying the groundwork for decades of storylines.
I mean, all that had happened at that point was they'd been introduced. We knew who they were and how they looked and how they applied their powers. Beyond that, everything was wide open. It was a chance to get in on the sub-level and build the characters, define the characters from the get-go.
His dialogue had more sophistication to it than a lot of other writers. It had more of an edge. He also was delving more deeply into character in ways that a lot of other comics writers of the time were not doing. Of course, he's famous for his strong female characters, much more independent, much more feminist than we've seen before.
You take these 7 people, 5 of whom were immigrants, and you throw them into a world that ideally is unlike anything they know. You had a wall down the middle of Europe. So for Peter Rasputin to come from the Ordinsky Collective to New York to work with the X-Men was making a valid and, in its own small way, revolutionary statement.
Chris and Dave Cockrum and later John Byrne were the ones who really sort of helped define these characters.
How do we define Nightcrawler? Well, he's German. And what does that mean? Well, we'll give him this fascination with films, and specifically with Errol Flynn pirate films. The idea of fencing, the idea of being physical.
Wolverine came along when I was doing the Hulk. The idea of making him a mutant was simply because I knew there was talk of someday doing this international book. I said, well, okay, so I'll give him a Canadian hero.
Len had envisioned him as a kid. He was 19, 20 years old, and that the claws were part of the costume, not the body. And the problem is, he didn't look like a kid. And especially in the first issue, he's presented as an officer. So we figured, let's go the other direction. Why not try him as being older? But then if he's older and he's got a healing factor, how old are we talking about? And then the third thing was, well, wouldn't it be cool if the claws actually came out of his body, if they were a part of him? And the first reaction was, oh, that's disgusting. Oh man, that's creepy. Oh, they are gonna love this. The reality for me from the very beginning was every time he pops his claws, he is slashing open his hand. So there's blood and there's pain. To me, that made him accessible and human. He wasn't just a magic monster. He is a guy who has a serious problem and he can't escape from it. And so how do we deal with it?
The pressure of a monthly schedule forced original artist Dave Cockrum to leave the book. He was replaced by John Byrne, an up-and-coming young artist whose collaborations with Chris drew more critical acclaim and attention to X-Men.
Now that we're so used to the X-Men being the hit, the #1, it may be hard to realize that at one point that it was the sort of the book that the aficionados knew and loved.
When I met Chris, I discovered he was pretty intense. I mean, he cared desperately about this third string book, and he poured his heart into it. And I read it, I thought it was pretty good.
Those people who, shall we say, had discerning taste knew that this was good, this was something different, this was a book that was going places. But it wasn't until into the 80s that the book really became this top seller.
One of Claremont's most successful early stories was the Phoenix Saga, which saw ordinary mutant Jean Grey transformed into a cosmically powerful entity, the Phoenix.
He had this idea that maybe like Phoenix could, like her powers could run amok a little bit and stuff. And I said, you know what? At Marvel Comics, we've had any number of villainous characters become heroic. We've never had a heroic character become evil. I mean, really evil. The next Doctor Doom, you know? And I said, why don't you do that?
The Dark Phoenix Saga, of course, really nailed it down as the comic that everyone was talking about.
The Dark Phoenix Saga saw Jean seduced by manipulative villain Mastermind until her powers ran amok, leading her to consume a planet filled with an alien race known as asparagus people, an act of genocide editor-in-chief Jim Shooter would not let stand.
When I became editor-in-chief, I would check the books out. I mean, no book would go to the printer without my signature. I remember checking out an issue of X-Men, I think whoa, you know, mass murder, holy cow.
So you came into my office and showed me the page.
Yeah, I know.
And you said, you know, she flares and the asparagus people are fried. And I said, Chris, you can't do that. And he said, oh yeah, Shooter said I could. You had shown it Salakrup.
No,
Yeah,
Salakrup
that's
said I
like-
could.
That's
We
like
thought-
saying,
That's
Mommy
right.
said I could,
That's right.
and then you bring it into
John,
bed.
John and I thought Salakrup had shown it to
Right,
Shooter, and
right.
it turned out, no, he hadn't.
And so I'm reading through these scripts and plots, and finally the plot for the last issue. And in the plot for the last issue, Dark Phoenix is captured by the Shi'ar, and she gets her brain adjusted, and then she's okay again, and she goes back and lives on Long Island with the X-Men, and everything's fine. I said, whoa, 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 what a wimpy ending. Nah. I said, you gotta do something better. He said, like what? So we had another one of our shouting arguments. And I suggested, I said, well, maybe, you know, for the first time in comic book history, she gets captured and sent to prison.
But then you automatically know that the next 40 issues of X-Men will be them trying to get to hell, breaking her out, failing, succeeding, failing, succeeding.
So he didn't like that. I said, well, then you figure it out. I don't. Okay, you're the writer. You do it. So the next morning he came in and he kind of strides into my office. He said, we're going to kill her.
Well, I figured if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right.
I said, okay, she's dead. It's done. It's a deal. It's a pact. She dies. And he's like, what do you mean? You know, now he starts arguing like, you can't kill her. I said, what do you mean me kill her? You just said you were going to kill her. So Chris goes out of my office, finds a phone someplace. Seconds later, my phone rings. It's John Byrne. And his first words were, are you crazy? And I said, no, we're killing her. That's it. So they're both yelling at me now. It was a bluff. They didn't really want to kill her. They did it sort of kicking and screaming. And yet that issue sold I sold through the roof. And P.S., it's a great issue.
The impact was huge. X-Men sales went through the roof. People reportedly sent flowers and death threats to the Marvel offices. It was the major sensational event of its day and really put the X-Men on the map sales-wise and critical-wise, and it sort of stayed there for the next 20, 25 years.
That same year, I flew the whole X-Men team out to San Diego, and that wasn't done in those days. They were mobbed everywhere they went. Mobbed.
It was an era in which the creators were becoming more prominent, were becoming stars, and that this was Chris Claremont's X-Men. And by the late 80s, it was outselling Spider-Man.
Though many today consider Dark Phoenix the high point of Chris's run, he was just getting started developing a universe of characters. After turning a hero into a villain with Phoenix, he set out to redeem the X-Men's arch nemesis, Magneto.
Magneto was sort of the typical Marvel villain, very much in the mode of Doctor Doom.
An irrational villain is a waste of time. Why should anyone care about him? What's heartbreaking about that?
You started to get this really intense backstory.
So with Magneto, what led him to this position? He's a young man in Auschwitz. He lost everything there. He survived. Somehow he survived. And each step of the way leads him towards putting on the suit and forming the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and coming out and trying to say, I've tried playing by your rules. It isn't working, fine. I'm going to impose my rules and you'll behave yourselves. I'm going to be the dad now and not the servitor.
This was a really bold way to reimagine a villain. It gave the character a depth that very few bad guys in superhero comics ever had.
Issue number 150 revealed Magneto's Holocaust backstory and also put him in contact with Kitty Pryde, a recently introduced teenage X-Men.
The beautiful paradigm of Kitty's presence in the X-Men was suddenly we had a young Jewish hero who is everything Magneto is fighting for. And the seminal moment in 50 is he damn near kills her. Not because he has anything against her, it's just he reacted. He saw the costume, she was attacking him, he struck back, and then realized, oh my God, it's a little girl. But within the context of the character that I was building, this is also a man who 20 years earlier had seen his own daughter, the same age, burned to death because she was different. And that was bringing home, in a primal sense, a personal sense, I am becoming that which I fought my entire life. Am I a good man who can reform himself through will? Or am I inevitably a monster?
With X-Men a bigger and bigger success, Marvel wanted to expand the brand, and corporate higher-ups pushed for a spin-off title.
Jim Shooter had been after the X-Men office, which was me and Chris essentially, to create another X book for a while. Chris didn't want to do that because he didn't want to water down the impact of the X-Men. I mean, he felt like he was doing it, and he was doing it well, and that really you didn't need another book. But commercially, Shooter wanted another success that was as big as the X-Men if he could manage it.
As soon as Chris realized that this was actually, I think, going to happen was when he sort of got serious about, okay, well, if there's going to be a spin-off, I'm going to do it. Because he was protective of his corner of Marvel.
Chris developed The New Mutants, which introduced a new cast of teenage characters studying at Xavier Academy.
After a little slightly rocky start, that became a real interesting book. I mean, that became our experimental book with Bill Sienkiewicz doing fantastic, weird, crazy, artsy stuff.
You had stuff that looked like it was drawn by little kids, you know, in crayon, and then you had stuff that just looked like beautiful Renaissance painting.
This looked cutting edge, and I think Chris responded to that by making the stories more cutting edge.
So I used to say, Bill, draw whatever you want. You're a genius. Why should I tell you what to draw? And he'd do these covers that were, to me, they were like brilliant. And Shooter would fight him
Tooth and nail.
Chris had to run everything past his editor, of course. The editor had to say yes or no.
Well, there are always clashes between writers and editors because you have different perspectives. The writer is very tunnel visioned. I want what is best for my book. Everybody else get the hell out of the way. The editor-in-chief, like it or not, has to balance those desires with the fact that you're playing in a community.
We fought like cats and dogs, me and him. He wanted to do all kinds of things, and X-Men was important. I paid attention to it.
But for the most part, I think that Chris had a surprising amount of creative freedom.
We could do whatever we wanted, really.
We just had to be a little tactful about it, that's all.
Chris, Weezy and I came up with storylines. There was nobody guarding the gate between us and the public. Sometimes your mistakes saw print, but so what? Because you were always able to stretch and do fun things.
Shooter was the only real major obstacle, and really he wasn't that bad.
Yeah, you could
certainly on the X-Men he wasn't that bad.
Oh no.
He had his moments, but
I tried never to say you must do this, but I would say this is the sort of thing we need because you know you've created this story and it needs to go someplace. And so we'd have these shouting matches, but it was always about the story.
Oh, when Shooter would get us all presents.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Oh, yes.
some of those presents were just like,
Well, you know when he got me a bondage outfit.
I know.
With a whip and a knife.
Claremont's run continued with artist Paul Smith and a series of stories that drove deeper into the personal and emotional lives of the characters.
You define certain specified moments. We're going in this direction, but these are organic characters, and it's not just a single character. You're dealing with a group of 7 to 14 characters in an issue. You don't know who will suddenly jump to the foreground.
Maddening but beautiful things about comics is that you have to give characters a sense of change without changing them so much that they violate the essence of who they are.
Dave, when we started, emphasized Nightcrawler because he loved Nightcrawler. He bonded with Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler to him was the coolest thing since sliced bread. John Byrne loved Logan, and that shifted the evolution in a slightly different direction. Smitty, I like to think that the character who stepped to the foreground was Storm.
Under Chris and Paul Smith, Storm had a personal crisis, lost her powers, and took on a new mohawk and leather look.
You know, I think one of the best things Chris came up with Storm was deciding that the goddess thing was getting a little tired and to put her in the biker outfit. Characters age and get stuck. The whole African worship thing started to feel a little like clunky and tacky. And, and just right at the right time, you have to recreate a character, but they have to stay the same.
Chris continued to expand and deepen his universe with new artist John Romita Jr., but was rudely surprised by the news that a new X-Men book would be starting without him, X Factor, and that the first issue would resurrect Jean Grey.
X Factor sprung from an idea that they had to reunite the original X-Men because Chris constantly added characters to the X-Men, and you ended up with a pool of X-Men characters that weren't in the X-Men, and obviously Marvel was going to think that it's a good idea to maybe do something with them since X-Men sells so well.
Chris had been told that if Jean was killed, she would never, ever, ever come back. This was the end. She was dead, 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 forever, ever, ever. And that was fine.
Oddly enough, even though it was Jim Shooter who was the one who decreed that Jean Grey must die for the Dark Phoenix saga, of course, he was one of the principal forces behind X Factor, which brings Jean back.
My idea is that when you kill a character, that character stays dead. And my idea with Phoenix was that she would remain dead. Well, it was John Byrne, I think, who came up with this Return of Phoenix idea.
The first thing she tells me is, well, there's something you need to know. What's that? They're bringing back Jean. And I said, what the? And I jumped up from the table, ran out the door, and called Shooter, who had the sense not to be in the office. So I couldn't, it was after hours, I couldn't go back and like punch him.
Before this, you called me and asked, and I said, oh, Shooter would never do that.
That's what we thought.
He swore to you.
Yeah.
So I gave you really bad advice. I mean, you would I calmed him down. Because I wasn't an editor at that time, I was just a freelancer. Shooter would never, ever do that. He wouldn't lie to you that way, I said. He's an honorable man.
Yeah.
Guess what?
And we had another shouting match.
It annoyed me that in the way in which X Factor was created, that the character of Scott, who was such a straight arrow and who would never, ever, ever have run off from his wife, and yet he was forced to by editorial craziness. A lot of times when readers notice a character acting out of character, what they need to do is look behind the curtains and see who the puppet masters are moving the strings.
X Factor was a critical dud, and original writer Bob Layton was soon replaced by Louise Simonson. She worked closely with Chris and brought the book more in line with his vision for X-Men. At the same time, Chris became known for an increasingly sprawling narrative style, with plot threads stretching multiple issues and even years before resolution.
Problem I always had with Chris on the book, and I loved his work, I read the book religiously while he was writing it, was he was always starting new stories.
And we were getting fast and loose and sloppy and having stories that went on for 6 issues, and we didn't know
Not at all like today.
It was like The Big Sleep, where not even, was it Raymond Chandler? Not even Raymond Chandler knew what was going on or how it ended, or that was kind of what we were up to. So.
You basically root around in a box, either on the floor or in your head, looking for something that catches your imagination, and you just start talking about it, and the next thing you know, you're stitching it into a story. Well, to me, it's all one story. Because life is a story, is a single story. And this is, to me, I'm not writing superhero adventures, I am telling the story of these characters' lives.
This period was notable for Chris taking time out for low-key personal stories like Life Death, in which Storm and mutant inventor Forge share an intimate dinner.
And that was a typical ratchet down the one-upmanship of how we're going to top ourselves, let's have a... And that was
we had a 5-page
story.
scene of Storm just sitting there drinking wine and wearing a pair of jeans and fixing a salad.
People have this wonderful pause, and then boom, you hit them with something.
And it gives you something to have your big story about, other than about explosions, which I personally happen to love. I have no problem with blowing things up and knocking buildings over. But it's nice to have it have a human context. And if you've got characters whom you've come to love involved in this event, then the event has meaning. And if you threaten these characters, it means a lot more than if it's just one explosion after another with no emotional context.
The only way you could do this day in and day out was to convince yourself these characters were real. So we had a lot of affection for them. So we would have conversations like, who's Kitty going to play with? Which sounds retarded.
But it was a reality of life. I mean, this is
Or even who
not
hasn't
going to go there. It's just
even who hasn't gotten laid in a while, you know? Let's give somebody a romance.
Claremont, of course, who felt very proprietary about these characters. What you start to see in the early 1980s is Chris Claremont spreading himself thinner and thinner, making sure that he can keep controlling what's going on with these corporate-owned properties. They're going to be published with or without him. And so he's just trying to make it as good as he can. And I think eventually, you know, he couldn't plug all of the holes.
the first 3 or 4 years being off the radar, we had our time to ourselves. Suddenly, down the line, you had crossovers. You know, as long as we could control the crossovers, it was a family affair.
The X-Men books were being done by a group of close collaborators and close friends.
And they enjoyed working together, and the Mutant Massacre sort of came from them.
Chris came into me and he said, I have this great idea. Paul Smith has drawn too many mutants in the alley. I'm just gonna have to kill some. And I said, oh man, Chris, that's just too big a story. That's too cool to do it just in one issue.
Can I play too?
That was exactly what Weezy just said. It was, sometimes people just all wanted
I just
to
thought
play.
it was fun. And then Walter
thought it
said,
was
oh,
fun.
can I play?
That's the way things were done back in the olden days. And that's why the olden days were better.
1986's The Mutant Massacre was the first X-Men crossover, a single story spanning Claremont's X-Men, Louise Simonson's X-Factor and Power Pack, and Walter Simonson's Thor. The massive success of this dark story led Marvel to demand yearly crossovers among the different X-Men titles.
There was just a need to keep filling the racks with X-Men comics because they sold well and they hadn't reached their saturation point yet. And Marvel was not going to stop until they reached their saturation point.
And then the next fall, Sheeter said, and you will do
another one.
crossover.
And this is what you're gonna do, blah, blah, blah. And we said, oh, no, Jim.
We pretended that we already had stuff planned for
Yes,
it.
we
We totally pretended, oh yeah, we have stuff planned for that.
That pretty much every year after that, you'd have some major storyline that crossed over into the various X-Men titles.
It became just a really complicated problem to solve every year, and then more than every year, and then seemingly all the time.
As the 80s went on, Chris phased out fan-favorite characters like Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler and worked with artist Mark Silvestri to build a new cast with characters like Dazzler and Longshot.
You pick up X-Men 100, you see the 7 characters, you figure, okay, this is who they are. You pick up 200, the characters have evolved.
If you took like one issue from each year, every single issue is going to have different characters in it, different styles in it. It constantly changed.
It would not be, to me anyway, unreasonable to have a totally different cast. That Scott retired, Scott's raising his kids. Maybe Storm has moved on, maybe Nightcrawler has become a priest. That allows the readers who were reading the book in 1990 to say, I've got someone who's my own. And then the readers who were reading it in 2000, maybe they find someone they can do the same with.
Towards the end of his run, Chris had reached a point that at that point no other comics writer really had, having been on these characters and on the same book continuously for 15 years. And I think Chris got to the point where he was trying to do the stories that still appealed to him after 16 years, which was new things. And he didn't want to do what pretty much every other superhero comic book does, which is basically recycle villains, recycle storylines.
How do we keep these long-term readers excited and intrigued and eager to find out what happens next? And that means there has to be a growth and evolution in the characters.
In the late 80s, Marvel was sold several times and eventually went public. Jim Shooter was ousted as editor-in-chief, and the new Marvel management was focused primarily on producing higher and higher quarterly earnings.
What changed was that as the X-Men became more popular, there was a demand for more X-Men material than Chris alone could write, or that Chris and his close colleagues like Louise could write, and Anne could write and edit themselves. There was going to be more and more people who had their fingers in the pie.
Sort of reluctantly, I allowed the X-Men franchise to expand.
Cha-ching! Money, 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 money.
Then about 1988, they added Excalibur, which Chris did, and Wolverine, which Chris did, but Chris didn't stay with Wolverine.
It suddenly gets more and more challenging to keep everything balanced.
I kind of feel like the X-Men became almost like a prison of Claremont's own making. The very success that the X-Men eventually attained meant that those characters were going to just keep being exploited in as many properties as they could.
You want to try and keep a balance between making the readers really excited or sustaining that excitement and come back, keep them coming back for more, but never let them get so much that it becomes a joke and becomes boring.
Are smart.
Artist Jim Lee joined the title and became an instant favorite with both fans and Marvel's management, including new X-Men line editor Bob Harras.
There was definitely a power shift, I think, where Jim Lee became the one who everyone saw as driving the book.
When the artists started to push back a little bit on what Chris Claremont was asking for in the stories, Bob Harras was very sympathetic to these artists. And Chris Claremont, who had been doing X-Men for about 15 years at this time, was hardly the type to just roll over and accommodate.
Jim had his own ambitions in terms of directions he wanted to take the stories, things he wanted to do with the characters. There was a growing sense of unease editorially with the fact that I'd been on this thing for 17 years.
The X-Men became so successful that it could no longer remain an auteur book.
Stories began to be handed down from the top down more and more and more. So it became a less fun place to work.
The thing that is so frustrating is that, the memory of sitting down back in 89 and 90 and 91 and looking at the numbers and thinking, holy shit, we are at a point where comics is not a peripheral industry anymore. We could actually think in terms of how can we expand, how can we make it even bigger and stronger.
With comic sales rising in the early 90s, Marvel planned a new X-Men title. For this series, Marvel wanted a return to the status quo. The X-Men would return to the mansion, and Magneto, the school's current headmaster and reformed villain, would return to his evil ways. This was all ordered through a
memo from higher authority. No, I mean, you mean X-Men 1? Yeah. No, that was Bob and Jim and higher-ups deciding editorially.
It was the prophet driving the progression of the book and progression of the story, honestly, as maybe it should.
It was a moment where they didn't want to do what I wanted to do, I didn't want to do what they wanted to do, and tempers carried everyone away.
In 1991, Chris and Jim Lee released X-Men #1, which sold 8 million copies and still holds the record for highest-selling comic of all time. 2 issues later, after 17 years as writer, Chris was off the book. He felt
betrayed, but that was then. We're talking literally 20 years ago.
The idea that one person could sort of control all of this stuff became increasingly difficult.
The problem was that there was no one who was able to pull all 3 parties together and sit them down and say, work it out. It just didn't work.
Marvel itself didn't even really acknowledge it in the books. There was no goodbye from Chris. There was no note saying this is Chris's last issue, which reflected, I think, Marvel's philosophy at that point, which was that they're just, that the characters sell the books and not the creators.
It was easier to walk away than stay immersed in a situation that was frustratingly unproductive. In retrospect, I should have been smarter, but that could be said by a lot of people over a lot of circumstances.
I thought that they didn't appreciate Chris as they should have, especially over time.
At the end of the day, you're playing with somebody else's toys, and you may write that character for years and be forever associated with that character, but the moment you step away, somebody else is going to fill that spot. Those toys are never coming home with you. They're always going to go back in the Marvel sandbox.
In Marvel Comics of the 21st century, there is no auteur like Chris Claremont was. It's just probably never going to happen again.
After Perlman took over the company and brought in all the marketing people, they kind of strip mined that. They said, hey, if they'll buy one X-Men title, they'll buy 2 or 4 or 6.
Despite numerous successful projects in the years since, Claremont never again reached the heights of his run on X-Men.
I still think people don't give him his proper due, and I think it's because he was so ubiquitous and so successful.
People bought the X-Men because they wanted to see what happened next month.
Those early X-Men issues dramatically changed mainstream comics, I think, and sort of set the stage for everything that's come since.
And I likened him to Babe Ruth, because Babe Ruth didn't invent the Yankees, and Claremont didn't invent the X-Men, but each of them built a house.
After Claremont's departure, the characters were often stagnant and archetypal, and the constant evolution of his years on the book came to an abrupt halt.
They want a regular, definable Logan because that's what the movie audience relates to. Whose voice is the most appropriate in terms of defining who the character is? Or does it become one vast, generic voice that has the risk of being incredibly uninteresting?
You have a charge, especially we used to think a lot about the younger readers.
Right.
Because the younger readers believe these characters are real.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a shitload of traumatized mail. No matter what you did to a character, and it kept you in touch with how every little thing you did, was profoundly, hit some kid somewhere.
I was at a coffee clutch one night, and there was a young woman there who was Mormon, and she was talking about how she loved the characters, that they spoke very eloquently to her as a person, as a woman, but also as a Mormon, as an outsider trying to find a place that worked. She was married, and her husband was willing to indulge her affection for the X-Men, so long as the kids were too young to read comics. But now the kids were getting older, and they were starting to read, and he felt that these comics were inappropriate because they dealt with themes that he felt were wrong for kids. And she was heartbroken because these were her friends. And she was facing a future where she would be unable to follow their lives. Not their adventures, their lives. And it had her in tears. And I'm sitting there thinking, holy shit. This is real for her. Not that the characters are real, but the conflict is real. The life, the moment is real. And she is going to lose something she holds of value. As a creator, as a writer, as a person, I not only have to respect that, I have to do my best to be worthy of that. If someone is going to commit to this work, to my work, to these characters, with that level of intensity, I have to make the characters and the stories worth that commitment and find a way to fulfill the promise. Our goal is to tell really great stories and 30 days later find a way to make it better. And if we're lucky enough to do that and sustain it, we and the audience can have a whole lot of fun. But that's the challenge. And the miracle is that we get a chance to try. The wonder and delight is that we pull it off.